on this episode of Indiana Education Insight.
Because as we said, it's a very symbiotic relationship between the superintendent and the board. And there has to be harmony and some mutual support and respect. And that's when great things happen. And you and I are here to facilitate that.
Every week, the Indiana Association of Public School Superintendents is taking you inside today's Indiana education collaboration and tomorrow's education trends. We're staying on the pulse of public school innovators throughout Indiana and beyond. Join our conversation and contribute to our upcoming topics at iapssin.org/podcast. Here's your host, Dr. J.T. Coopman.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Indiana Education Insight. I'm Dr. J.T. Coopman, Executive Director of the IAPSS. This podcast is being delivered by the IAPSS team and produced by our friends at Edge Media Studios. As Executive Director of IAPSS, I'm proud to bring you this weekly show featuring Indiana education innovators from all over our great state. Each week, we'll be discussing trending topics in the public education space and bringing in a variety of education innovators to hear their perspective. We're also talking to higher education leaders and educators at the state level, working together as proactive public education advocates. As with any organization, it takes skilled leadership to be successful, and that is one of the main missions of IAPSS, developing great public education leaders. We're always excited to have experienced and passionate educators joining the show. So let's get started with today's conversation.
Topics and trends in Indiana education.
Today's guest, Dr. Brian Smith, Executive Director of the Indiana School Boards Association. Dr. Smith served as a teacher, principal, and superintendent in various Indiana school districts before becoming the Executive Director of ISBA. So having the ability to look at education from various lenses is very important. Of course, Dr. Smith has been a tremendous asset to public education in Indiana. So let's find out how he views the issues in Indiana public schools. I'd like to welcome you, Dr. Smith. Thank you for being on today's show. So tell us a little bit about yourself and about your role in ISBA.
Well, JT, thanks for the invitation to be here. I've been involved in public education for almost 50 years now, and as you said, in various capacities. Love what I do. I love working with the School Boards Association and all of the experiences I've had in our public schools. Mainly at the School Boards Association, we spend a lot of time providing legal advice to superintendents and board members. We do in-service programs throughout the year on specialty topics that we think board members can benefit from. Of course, we do onboarding for new board members as elections periodically occur. We also provide legislative representation on topics that are important to public schools across our state. And then additionally, we provide strategic planning opportunities to school boards and superintendents on an as-need basis. And so if we're invited in, we'll work with them to help put their plans together.
Okay. So how did, you were a superintendent for a number of years. How is this role different than what you were doing as a superintendent?
You know, all of the roles seem to blend together, but here's an opportunity to really provide support to board members across the state. Since board members do change periodically, we constantly need to provide the kind of in-service that they need to be good stewards of their school corporation, talking about student performance, talking about budgeting, talking about having that vision of where their public school needs to go and how to drive that vision, how to stay connected with their public. And so it's a learning process, and board members become more effective as they spend more time on the board. And our responsibility is to lead them along that way. And so in my years as a teacher and then also as a principal and then as a superintendent, I've gotten to see school operations from a lot of different lights. And, the thing that I'm always brought back to, and I know you are too, and that is we always have to go back to asking ourselves the question, is this what's best for kids?
Right.
And so that's a really important premise, and we try to instill that concept across the state.
Okay, well, school boards are obviously, we believe in local control. And one of the things that you do in your role as a lobbyist at the State House, and one of the things that I do as a lobbyist for the superintendents, is try to get our legislators to recognize that local control is a very important element. Are there issues with local control, and how do you promote that with school boards?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because our mantra is local control. Most educational decisions are best made by the people that it affects, and that is local communities and school boards. And so it's important to give them the tools and the authority to make decisions for their children. It's really important for board members to get involved legislatively. And so how do you do that? Well, we encourage school boards to either individually or linking up with other school districts in their area to have legislative dinners, to invite their local legislators in and to talk about upcoming topics that are going to affect their schools and what do their legislators think about those, and talk about the local control issue. And just making that connection to let legislators know that we're there to support them, we want to help, and we're very interested in what's going on in our schools, because I tell you, during the legislative session, that personal connection many times can make a big difference in having an influence over a piece of legislation that's going through the legislature at that time.
Absolutely. Well, and I certainly encourage superintendents that to remind those local legislators that if there are things that affect their local constituents and the local district by a decision made by legislators, and make sure that our public knows about that.
Absolutely, and we also encourage our board members to call their local legislators. We have found that sometimes legislators get a little bit hardened to emails because they'll get a lot of them, and form emails will go out, if you will. Many times that personal phone call makes a big difference. And interestingly enough, legislators do want to hear from their constituents. They do want to hear from board members. Those are elected officials, just like them. And so it's important to make that connection and to know that they can make a difference. We also tried to invite board members down during the legislative session to testify on a bill that may be important for them in their local district. And many times lobbyists like yourself and myself are up there talking and representing our organizations. But, legislators also want to hear from school people.
Absolutely.
And I know it's difficult at times for them to get away, but this can be very important.
Yep. We're going to kind of take a little bit of a different tact here, and we know that there's research has indicated that there's a direct correlation between leadership and successful outcomes for schools. How can school boards and superintendents work together to ensure these successful outcomes?
I think that board members that avail themselves of as many professional development opportunities that they can tend to become more effective and better board members. They're focused on the right things. School board members tend to focus on district policy, on financial resources, allocation of those resources, and having a vision for where that school district is going. And so we provide the tools for them to make those kind of decisions, and not to get out in the weeds and be concerned about minutia, but they need to be the big picture people, and they need to work very closely with the superintendent. And we try to ensure that good communications always exist, and we promote with board members. If there's ever a problem with communications between a board and a superintendent, get that fixed. We're glad to intervene. When we meet with boards, we always ask that the superintendent can be there. And sometimes just having that third party come in to open up the dialogue. When good communications are happening, school boards and superintendents working together with all of their staff, boy, they can do some wonderful things.
Yeah, they sure can. And that has to be a harmonious relationship, because
Absolutely.
it can go south pretty quickly. Even though we're a couple of months away from getting into the next General Assembly session in 2018, in 2017, which was a long session, We have short and long sessions in the state of Indiana. What are some of the bills that you feel like that have that were passed that are probably the most impactful on public education?
Well, there were some good and some not so good. Senate Bill 409 changed the collective bargaining date from August 1 to September 15th. The idea being that we would have more data to make good decisions about money and hopefully provide the very best we could for teachers and staff. And so I heard mixed feedback on that. Overall, I think that was probably an okay thing to do. Schools can always start earlier if they want to informally. Senate Bill 498 restored the master's degree compensation piece. The Indiana Education Employment Relations Board had taken a very narrow view of the master's degree and said you could get a bump in salary when you earned it, but then after that it was gone. And that bill now changed that so that can be, once you've earned it, you can be compensated for that from that point forward. House Bill 1007 now requires schools to provide online courses to students if requested by parents, and the school has to pay the tuition for those courses. Wasn't real thrilled with that bill. I'm not sure how that's going to work out. I guess that's one of those we'll wait and see what it takes and what it looks like. Yep. Senate Bill 337 requires a school district to offer an elective class each year on racial and ethnic groups. And so it's not a requirement, but an elective, and it has to be made available. And finally, one that's really, I think, kind of important was House Bill 1079. And this is a bill where all employees that are going to have contact with kids have to have a expanded criminal background check and an expanded index check. And now this has to be done over the next 5 years. And so for all new people coming in, they have to be checked immediately. But for all employees, you have 5 years now to little by little get everybody checked off. And so, we're in a different world today than we used to, and parents want to know that their child's in a safe environment, and anything that we can do to promote that is important. Right. And so with the technology that we have today, I think that's an attempt to do that very thing.
And one of the bills that didn't pass, but I think is worthy to comment on because it'll probably come back and be revisited, and that was the student journalism bill. And that was something that both you and I reacted to. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the bill was titled Protection for Student Journalists, and on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. I was supportive of that and actually talked with some student journalists. But as it turned out, it was more of a free speech bill in that it reduced the amount of oversight that a school would have on student journalists. And to the extent where you could have lewd or vulgar language in a school publication or a yearbook or on a radio station, and you couldn't do anything about it. And that didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. I was talking to a board member the other day, JT, and said, we have a school where we don't do any censoring. They're just wide open. And I said, but that's your right. You've made that choice. That's a local decision. Mm-hmm. That's not for everybody. And we've used some examples of where articles would have appeared that actually got caught and got changed. They would have just been very embarrassing, not only for the community, but for some of the students that were singled out in them. Now, understand, student journalists across the board in Indiana are just some great kids. They work hard. They're very intelligent. This is nothing against them. I was all for trying to provide protections for journalists, and in fact, we even offered an opportunity that if there was some type of censorship and the student felt like it wasn't appropriate, that there could be some type of a mediation body that could arbitrarily make a decision outside of that. So, we wanted to work with it, but it went a different direction than we thought and wasn't probably the best thing for the students or the school. So I think you're right. It'll probably be back again, and we'll be back with the same message. We're here to support student journalists and always will be.
Yeah, and certainly my sense is that There was some bending, but not enough bending to do things, I think, that protect the school system and students from the adverse effects of little to no oversight. And students can pretty much write whatever they want, and there wouldn't be any foul called on them. So that, 16, 17-year-old kids, I'm sorry, for the most part, just don't have the maturity or the intellectual capacity to always make the best decisions. If they think it's going to be funny or hilarious, oh yeah, let's go ahead and get that printed. Not a good decision.
And for the most part, to their credit, students have done a great job. We have very few incidents that do occur. Journalism instructors overall do a great job. But every now and then, we'll get an issue like you just described, and the community expects the school to step up and say, okay, we need to talk about this.
Right. I agree with you. So you've been around for a long time. You've been in a variety of capacities, and now as the executive director of the Indiana School Boards Association, even a new path in your career. Where do you see the future of public education headed in Indiana?
You hear a lot of negative press about public schools, but I think the future for public education is really bright. Unfortunately, the media tend to dwell on some of the negative things that happen in schools. And what we need to remember is to put that in perspective. That is such a small part of what's happening across the state. Mm-hmm. As we go from very small rural to urban districts across the state, there are just great things happening. I mean, it's just outstanding. And shame on us, we don't publicize those sometimes as much as we should. So I think the future looks bright. If anything, we need to better inform the public about the great things happening in our public schools. It's the most stable institution in our society and will remain that way. And I think kids are just getting a great education.
Well, I agree with you. And actually, that was one of the reasons that we've created this podcast is to develop a forum where we can talk about the great things that are happening in public schools. And we've had other guests on throughout the short tenure of our podcast that have talked about many of the great things going on in public schools. And so certainly from our perspective, we want this podcast to exist to extol the virtues of public education and what's going on in Indiana public schools. So thank you for recognizing that. Okay, now we've asked you to be a prognosticator and look into your crystal ball. Any advice that you would like to give to school boards and superintendents or others in leadership capacities?
Well, as we mentioned earlier in this podcast, for all decisions that we make, and for board members also, we always say, is this what's best for students? Is this decision the best thing for our students?
Right.
And then second, are we really keeping our community engaged and staying in touch with what they want and what students need? And third, are we making educational excellence job one? Is that our number one priority over and above anything else?
Right.
And does everything else feed into that? If I think we can focus on those three things and we always have that in the back of our mind, we're going to continue to do great things.
Well, I appreciate that. And certainly with tremendous leadership that you afforded us as a principal and as a superintendent, now as the executive director of the Indiana School Boards Association, I will tell you that we appreciate everything that you've done with the thousands of students that you've worked with and with school boards even in today's role. So.
Well, thanks. And likewise with the Superintendents Association. I mean, we work hand in glove so many times on projects, on in-service training, because as we said, it's a very symbiotic relationship between the superintendent and the board. And there has to be harmony and some mutual support and respect. And that's when great things happen. And you and I are here to facilitate that.
That's right. That's right. I appreciate you mentioning that. Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Brian Smith for being our guest on the IPSS edition of Indiana Education Insight. Now it's time to wrap up this episode with my take on the current state of affairs in Indiana education.
Dr. JT's closing comments.
Unfortunately, even though we have so much research about the fact that leadership matters regardless of the organization, but especially in schools, Just like we need a commitment to high-quality public schools and educators, we need to make an investment in high-quality leadership programs for our public schools. It's my hope that we can demonstrate the value of leadership development programs to our legislators and get our state leaders to contribute to these programs on behalf of our Hoosier communities. And much of this research has been dismissed by our legislators. However, I see these as investments in our children and in our state, not as an expenditure. Perhaps we can pursue this issue and others on another segment. On our next show, August 28th, we will welcome Dr. Pam Wright, Director of the Indiana Department of Education Division of Exceptional Needs. Perhaps she can provide some of the additional insight into the State House and education. Join us for that and more on the next Insight into Indiana Education. Thanks for being part of education. Please stand up for Indiana Public Schools.